This talk is entitled A Love That Knows No Bounds. We read in the book of Isaiah a prophecy. This is the words of Isaiah in regards to something that God, our Father in heaven, holds very deep in his heart, and that's the kind of relationship that he seeks with every one of us. I'll read it to you. I just want to point out, for this slide only, I changed. In your Bible, it will read the Lord in all capitals here. And there's legitimate debate over how the Tetragrammaton, the in Hebrew, the Yod-He, Vav-He, how it's pronounced. I'm convinced of this pronunciation. It doesn't matter if you agree or not, because there are different ways of reading it. For your Maker is your husband, Yehovah of hosts is his name, and the Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer, the God of the whole earth he is called. For Yehovah has called you like a wife, deserted and grieved in spirit, like a wife of youth when she is cast off, says your God. We're going to spend most of our time today on a particular story in the New Testament, but before we get there, I want to spend what I hope will not be too rushed of a time looking at two stories in the Old Testament that set up the story in the New Testament, and I hope you'll find it really fascinating. We're going to start in Genesis 24, and this is the story of how Isaac and Rebekah came to be acquainted. And it was probably about 2150 BC. Now, I love maps, and I want to show you what we're talking about here as far as geography. First, I'll remind you that Abraham was the one that God called out of a foreign land and brought him to Canaan. Traditionally, we've believed Abraham came from this Ur and made his way all the way up here and then went down there. There's actually a really good case for the possibility that Ur, that Abraham was from, is Ur-Kesh, which actually was the same city that our friend David Love helped to dig out in his archaeological digs. But whether it was here or there, Abraham made his way down to Canaan. He has a son named Isaac, and our story starts with Isaac here. Yes, and now this is Abraham's request to his most reliable servant in terms of asking that servant to go back to the home of Abraham's origins and find for his son Isaac a wife. And forgive me if we kind of read through these kind of rapidly, because we're going to want to slow down with the story in the New Testament. But now Abraham was old, well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. And Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all that he had, "Put your hand under my thigh, that I may make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and God of the earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell, but will go to my country and to my kindred and take a wife for my son Isaac." I will momentarily stop, and we're going to point out this, "Put your hand under my thigh and swear to me." There was evidently an ancient tradition whereby you could ask someone to swear by putting their hand under your thigh and perhaps even having their hand very near to your genitals, seriously. And especially when making an oath about having something to do with that person's offspring. And that seems to be exactly what's going on here. Put your hand under my thigh. And so he's asking his servant to go back to this area and find a wife. Then the servant took 10 of his master's camels, 10 camels, keep that in mind, and departed, taking all sorts of choice gifts from his master. And he arose and went to Mesopotamia, to the city of Nahor. Mesopotamia, of course, simply means the area between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. And he made the camels kneel down outside the city by the well of water at the time of evening, the time when women go out to draw water. Keep that in mind too, the time of evening when women go out to draw water. And he said, "O Lord, God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today and show steadfast love to my master Abraham. Behold, I am standing by the spring of water, and the daughters of the men of the city are coming out to draw water. Let the young woman to whom I shall say, 'Please let down your jar that I may drink,' and who shall say, 'Drink, and I will water your camels,' let her be the one whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac. By this I will know that you have shown steadfast love to my master." Before he had finished speaking, behold, Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother. So this is Rebekah, the daughter of Abraham's nephew, came out with her jar on her shoulder. The young woman was very attractive in appearance, a maiden whom no man had known. She went down to the spring and filled her jar and came up. Then the servant ran to meet her and said, "Please give me a little water to drink from your jar." She said, "Drink, my lord." And she quickly let down her jar upon her hand and gave him a drink. When she had finished giving him a drink, she said, "I will draw water for your camels also until they have finished drinking." So she quickly emptied her jar into the trough and ran again to the well to draw water, and she drew for all his camels, 10 camels. The man gazed at her in silence to learn whether the Lord had prospered his journey or not. Now, you have to know a little bit something about the type of camel we're dealing with here. Evidently, there are two types of camel in the world. Now the name escapes me. The one with 2 humps is a Bactrian camel, and it's further in the east and in colder temperatures. And this is this camel is in deserts. And anyway, the point is that after a long, hot journey, a camel like this was capable of drinking gallons of water. And so this woman brings enough water back and forth from the well to the trough to water up 10 thirsty camels. This was a prodigious act of strength and vigor and determination, and keep that in mind too. When the camels had finished drinking, the man took a gold ring weighing a half shekel and 2 bracelets for her arms weighing 10 gold shekels and said, "Please tell me whose daughter you are. Is there room in your father's house for us to spend the night?" She said to him, "I am the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, whom she bore to Nahor." She added, "We have plenty of both straw and fodder and room to spend the night." The man bowed his head and worshipped the Lord and said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his steadfast love and his faithfulness toward my master. As for me, the Lord has led me in the way to the house of my master's kinsman, to my own master's own family." Then the young woman ran and told her mother's household about these things. Okay, now let me summarize what happens next. Just in summary, Rebekah runs back to her home to tell her of her encounter with this servant of Abraham. Her brother Laban and her family members come out to the well to greet the man, and they invite him into their home. And there, a conversation takes place, and a marriage agreement is concluded. A marriage agreement is reached in which Rebekah agrees to go with Abraham's servant back to Canaan to marry the son of Abraham, Isaac. Now, this is where things become so interesting, and I tell you that Bible study is always worth the time you put into it. This is a man named Robert Alter. Robert Alter is a professor of Hebrew and comparative literature at the University of California, Berkeley. He's written some 24 books, and in 2018 he published his translation of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, a translation with commentary by Robert Alter. Olia and I were reading that story that I just read to you a few years ago now in his translation and reading his commentary about it, and what he pointed out to us, I think you'll find very, very interesting. He says that story we just read is the first of what, it forms what he calls the betrothal type-scene. The betrothal type-scene. Betrothal, of course, is a word having to do with engagement and planned marriage. And type-scene is a scene, a series of happenings that forms kind of a pattern, forms sort of a template for future similar scenes. The betrothal type-scene involves these core elements: travel to a foreign land, encounter with a young woman at a spring or a well, the drawing of water, and a superhuman feat of some kind is performed. Marriage is intended or discussed or proposed. There is a hurrying or running to tell the news of the stranger's arrival. And then the type scene culminates with a feast at which a marriage agreement is concluded, the betrothal type scene. We don't have to go very much further into Genesis to find our next example of this, but let me catch you up as you, in case you don't know about Rebekah and Isaac. Rebekah returns with Abraham's servant to Canaan. This is what happens over the next days to decades. and marries Abraham's son Isaac. Isaac and Rebekah have two sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob, the younger, steals the birthright from Esau, his older brother. Esau threatens to kill Jacob for this. This is a very dysfunctional family. And so if you have a dysfunctional family, then fear not. God can use you. I have a dysfunctional family, by the way. Jacob flees for his life back to the east. So Jacob, now we're going to learn about how Jacob becomes acquainted with Rachel in perhaps 2100 BC. Jacob flees for his life and he comes back to this part of the world again, Mesopotamia, between the rivers. We'll buzz through this as well. Genesis 29 reads, Then Jacob went on his journey and came to the land of the people of the east. As he looked, he saw a well in the field, and behold, 3 flocks of sheep lying beside it, for out of that well the flocks were watered. The stone on the well's mouth was large, and when all the flocks were gathered there, then the shepherds would roll the stone from the mouth of the well and water the sheep and put the stone back in its place over the mouth of the well. Jacob said to them, My brothers, where do you come from? They said, We are from Haran. He said to them, Do you know Laban, the son of Nahor? They said, We know him. He said to them, Is it well with him? They said, It is well, and see, Rachel, his daughter, is coming with the sheep. Jacob said, Behold, it is still high day. He seems kind of bossy. Behold, it is still high day. It is not time for the livestock to be gathered together. Water the sheep and go pasture them. He's just met these guys, already telling them what to do. But they said, We cannot until all the flocks are gathered with all the shepherds, and then we have enough manpower to roll the stone off the mouth of the well, and then we water the sheep. While he was still speaking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess. Now, as soon as Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, Laban is his mother's brother, this is his cousin, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, Jacob came near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. Jacob performs the task, the feat that it takes 3 or 4 or 5 men otherwise to perform. And the rock may have looked something like this. Who knows how big it was? But the point is, the writer of this narrative wants us to know that Jacob just performed a physical act which is unusual for one man to do, a superhuman feat, as it were. And so you can kind of picture Jacob maybe he's motivated in part by the need I want to do something manly here because this girl is hot and I want her to notice me. And so now you might lower the lights and put on the mood music because the very next verse says that then Jacob kissed Rachel. And you're thinking, that's my boy. Doing pretty well. Doing pretty well until you finish that verse. The very sentence goes on and reads, and wept aloud. So Jacob kissed Rachel and then broke down crying. But I think we have to remember that this was a different culture than ours, and he was just overcome with emotion, and men were free to share their emotions. There was nothing wrong with that. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's kinsman and that he was Rebekah's son, and she ran and told her father. And so a summary now to move the story along. Jacob eventually marries Rachel after many years of labor, after first being deceived into marrying Rachel's older sister Leah. You remember that story. He winds up with 2 wives and 2 concubines, and he becomes the father of the tribes of Israel, 12 sons that he has. But in his, you'll recall the story of his wrestling match with the angel of the Lord. Jacob, whose name means deceiver, is renamed Israel, which means roughly he who struggles with God, or he who has struggled with God. Jacob is renamed Israel and becomes the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay, and that's but we've just seen our second installment of the betrothal type scene in the book of Genesis. Travel to foreign land, encounter with future bride at a well, drawing of water, superhuman feat performed, marriage intended or discussed, and then a hurrying or running to tell the stranger is coming, and then the marriage agreement is made. We won't take any time with it here, but Moses also meets his wife, what's his wife's name? Zipporah, that's right, in a very similar situation. There's actually 3 betrothal type scenes in the book of Genesis. But I want to ask you, do any other stories in the Bible fit this betrothal type scene pattern? Yes. Who's got it? Sorry? Yes. Yeah, I heard the yes part, and then what was your answer? Jesus, I think what you're getting at is the Samaritan woman at the well. in John chapter 4. Now, I would propose that this is no mistake, this is no coincidence, this is no just sort of like superficial similarity. I think there is real design going on here in the biblical narrative and the actions of Jesus, and so let's look at that. But before we get to that story, you need to know a little bit about the Samaritans and why they were considered so other by the Jews of Jesus' day. So back to history a little bit here before we move to the New Testament. Several hundred years after Jacob's death and the tribes of Israel, they're enslaved in Egypt. They're brought into the Promised Land, into Canaan. A few hundred years go by, a string of kings comes and goes, and the last of the kings under the united monarchy is Solomon, son of David. And when he dies in about 930 BC, the united monarchy is split into two, a northern kingdom which kept the name Israel and was 10 tribes, and the southern kingdom of Judah, which was simply Judah and Benjamin. So history then moves on for a couple of hundred years with these two kingdoms divided, all while things are pretty much going from bad to worse in both kingdoms, but particularly in Israel, where they're engaged in all kinds of idolatry. And not to get ahead of ourselves, but there is that little section of map we just looked at, and the big gorilla in the political world at the time was the kingdom of Assyria, and they were masters of this entire area during the time that we're concerned with here. So, and we read about this in 2 Kings 17. Israel has split into the northern and southern kingdoms. Idolatry and a perverted version of the worship of God taking place in the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, in which the king there, Jeroboam, had appointed priests. Pretty much anybody who wanted to be priest and was willing to do the job could become a priest, whereas the books of Moses and the book of Leviticus told us that priests need to be from the tribe of Levi. The point is that the priests were sort of a government-sanctioned religion in the northern kingdom of Israel. And this sort of idolatry and perversion of worship led to its downfall. The 10 tribes of Israel were carried off into captivity by that massive political power, the Assyrians. And what's interesting and where the Samaritans come in is the cities that had been populated in Israel by Israelites in those 10 tribes, they were repopulated by foreigners from other lands. And so what happened was, bit by bit, piecemeal by piecemeal, cities were conquered by Assyria. The people living there were brought and scattered out throughout. Those were all lands that had been conquered by Assyria. The people living there were put on buses and brought down here to live in the cities here. And so you have Assyria relocating people for the purpose of preventing any sort of conspiracy against the king, keep the people that know each other separated, bring in strangers to the land, and it's easier to keep under control. Part of what they were up to was Assyria's main enemy was Egypt, and you needed some human shields in between here, and then you can also tax them and so on. So there's several reasons why this took place. But foreigners are imported to possess the cities formerly populated by the Israelites. And once they get there, they started to come under attack by lions, the 2 Kings says. These were not, of course, African lions. They were probably some sort of mountain lion. But they were under attack by lions, and they believed, well, the reason we're under attack by lions is we don't know the God of the land here. These were people that came from perhaps Persia or wherever, and they thought, we need to get to know the God of the land here where we are now, or these lions are going to keep attacking us. So they send a letter to the king of Assyria, and they ask for help. And he sends back to them some of the priests, the politically correct, government-sanctioned priests, back to Samaria to teach the people how to obey and how to worship the God of Israel there. And so you had, and this people group becomes the Samaritans. Under the tutelage of illegitimate priests, they're taught how to worship God, and their center of worship was this Mount Gerizim, and they erected a temple there, which we'll get there. Now, Mount Gerizim figures into our story. We now finally come to the Gospel of John, and I think we'll slow down just a little bit. Now, John chapter 4 is this story that we're going to spend our time on, but just a couple of inches above in the text, above where John chapter 4 begins, you have John the Baptist, John the Baptist was, of course, the man who preached to ready the people for Jesus. The Messiah is coming. John the Baptist's role was to clear the way for Jesus. And he makes this comment just before our story. John the Baptist says, "The one who has the bride is the bridegroom." Now we move on to John 4. Now, when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that he was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples, he left Judea and departed again for Galilee. And here's our map again. I want to highlight for you, there's Jerusalem. They've been baptizing people here around the river. Jesus catches wind that the Pharisees are hot on his tail and decides to regroup up in Galilee. And so he's going to move back up into Galilee. And by the way, I think last time I spoke, we talked about him being in Nazareth on a Sabbath. He's on his way up, and that event is taking place in just the next few weeks. On his way up there, we read in John, and he had to pass through Samaria. Oh, okay, so he had to pass through Samaria. Well, anyone familiar with the geography and the roads knows, why would he do that? He doesn't have to pass through Samaria. There's a road up to Galilee that comes along the Jordan River, the river route, probably the most commonly traveled one by pious Jews needing to get to Galilee, because they would avoid Samaria like you would avoid a leper colony. He also had this option to take the scenic route over here along the plain of Sharon, west of the mountains, with the sea in view. It's quite a few more miles, but maybe that's a nice way to go. We could have taken our time and enjoyed the trip. No. John tells us that Jesus had to go through Samaria. We wonder why. It wasn't geography that forces him through Samaria. So he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. There's rich and deep history here. Jacob's well was there, so Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well. It was about noon. Some of the versions say it was the 6th hour. And so, one more map. I think this might be our last map. I want you to see how the road that they came up winds its way through these hills. It reaches this sort of open plain, a little bit of a valley here. We're in the district of Samaria, and we have Jacob's well and a little town called Sychar, and we're right at the foot of Mount Gerizim. I think it's pronounced Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, but Mount Gerizim is of interest to us. This is roughly what their view was. This is a colorized photo from probably the late 19th century. I think we're standing on Gerizim, and I think that's Ebal there. We're looking to the north. This is the well. This is Jacob's well. At the time that our story takes place, it's already 1,500 years old. And so it was an old well. Jacob himself dug it, and it's housed, or it's encased within a house of some kind in the city of Nablus in the West Bank. Moving on, we read, a woman from Samaria came to draw water. We just read this was noon. Women don't come to draw water at noon. The writer wants us to realize that's kind of odd. We don't expect that. We don't expect her, and she didn't expect anyone to be at the well. She arrives at the well, and I want to point out that it takes half a minute to read this story. The story itself, the scene itself, took a little bit of time, and so let's not hurry. She arrives at the well, surprised that there's someone there, and he looks like he's a Jewish man. I think Jesus gave her some time to get acclimated to his presence, and so maybe she had begun to put her bucket down into the well. This well is 30 meters deep. It's about 100 feet. It took a while to get your bucket down there. After a period of time where maybe she's breathing a little bit more easily and undisturbed by his quiet presence, Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink," for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria?" And John, the writer, writes parenthetically, "For everyone knows that Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. They're practically untouchables." I want to give credit again to our friend Sigve Tonstad. And boy, if you learn anything today, jot this down and go to YouTube and look up Sigve Tonstad series on the book of John. This is the 7th lecture, rereading the 4th gospel, story of Jesus the revealer, the woman at the well. This man is an amazing teacher. But this woman is puzzled. Why are you talking to me? And she's aware of at least 3 boundaries. Now, Jesus has crossed a boundary from Judah into Samaria. He's already crossed one boundary that, it's kind of questionable whether you should be doing that, Jesus. And now he's crossed an ethnic, tribal boundary. She's aware that you're Jewish, I'm Samaritan, we pretty much dislike each other on a good day. Why are you talking to me? He has crossed a religious boundary. They both know that they have deeply held differences in what they believe is the correct way to worship God and who God is. There are religious boundaries that Jesus just strolls right through, strolls right past that boundary. There's a gender boundary. It's not unproblematic that a man and woman, unchaperoned, are having a conversation even in the broad daylight like this. Men and women were well advised, if they were pious in any way, to avoid that kind of even the appearance of evil. Let's put it that way. So there's an ethnic tribal boundary, there's a religious boundary, there's a gender boundary. Jesus has just blown past them all. And whether she knows it yet or not, there's a moral boundary. If you're familiar with the story, you know something about this woman's moral resume. And Jesus blows by that too, as we will see. But I want to point out too that she's just had her first or maybe second. She's surprised that there's a man at the well at the middle of the day at noon. There's usually nobody there at that time. And then she's surprised that he speaks to her. She's going to have a series of escalating surprises with Jesus, and it's going to culminate somewhere. Jesus answered her, if you knew the gift of God, if you knew what it is that God gives and who it is that is saying to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. The woman said to him, Sir, and we notice that she is polite with Jesus, Sir, you have nothing to draw water with. You have no bucket, and the well is deep. It's 100 feet deep. Where do you get that living water? Here again we have Jesus and a human being talking to each other on a difference of levels. Jesus is talking about something spiritual, water that we'll be speaking of in a moment, and she's talking so he's talking on the vertical plane, right? And she's on the horizontal plane of water that you drink from a cup. Time and again in the book of John, we have Jesus having these conversations. He talks to Nicodemus about being born again, and Nicodemus is like, I haven't seen that happen lately. This different level. Where do you get that living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob? He gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and his livestock. This woman herself has brought up Jesus' identity. In the back of her mind, she's wondering, who is this cat? Who is this strange man? Are you greater than our father Jacob? Jesus said to her, everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never be thirsty again. The water that I will give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life. I want to back up one step and point out something I meant to say, that when Jesus asks her for a drink, he has something to offer her that she cannot at this moment imagine the value and the glory of it. But he puts himself on a level below her and requests of her a drink in the attempt of opening up trust, for her to trust him. Yeah, he's Jewish, and they usually treat us really poorly, but he's asking me for something that I can give him. I meant to say that. But he's clearly now talking about a different kind of water. The water that I will give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life. The woman said to him, Sir, give me this water so that I will not be thirsty or have to come here to draw water. Probably everyone here is familiar with this story already, and you know something about this woman already. When she says, I won't have to come here to draw water again, what I hear and what I see is the experience of a woman who has been completely rejected by her own people because of her own moral failings in life. And she spent her life alone, with the exception of certain companions, which we'll learn about momentarily. This is a woman who If she had a theme song, I think her theme song would be like the one that was in a musical some years ago, in which she would sing, "I dreamed a dream in time gone by, when hope was high and life worth living. I dreamed that love would never die. I dreamed that God would be forgiving." That's the experience of this woman in her damaged heart. And Jesus brings the conversation back to a level plane, a horizontal plane. He says to her, "Go, call your husband and come here." I think there was a pause. And the woman answered him, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, and we can be sure that he did everything possible and necessary to put her at ease. He said, "You are right in saying, 'I have no husband,' for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you now have is not your husband. What you have said is true." And now there was a long pause in their conversation. Jesus has just laid bare to this woman her own heart, her own story, her own failings. He has just laid bare the roots of those failings, which we can wonder or we can suspect were rooted in some kind of trauma, perhaps very early in life. She has gone for one reason or another from one man to another, to another, to another. 5 men or 4 men, 5 men have found it necessary to divorce her. And she's had a heart which for a number of years or decades now has just been living on life support. And Jesus very gently revealed that to her. And this is her penultimate surprise today. She's just met a man that knows her whole story, and yet she feels comfortable with him. Who is this man? He knows my whole story. Many people have thought that this next verse indicates, and I have thought that this next verse indicates actually that she's just trying to change the subject. Let's change the subject. And Sigve has helped me to see this differently. They've reached a point in the conversation where nothing more needs to be said about that. And in some sense, just body language, just silence conveys the acquiescence, the agreement. Yes, you're right. And she says, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship." Jesus said to her, "Woman," also a term of respect, "Woman, madam, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews." I hope I can convince you that this was not an insult. And we're going to take a step back to the verse, "neither on this mountain." I've told you that they're at the foot of Mount Gerizim. This was roughly their view as this conversation is taking place at Jacob's Well. Mount Gerizim was the location of the Samaritan temple. So the Samaritans, which we've defined, they had built a temple up here in about 450 BC. And literally, their temple was named to the god of no name. The Greek word would be anonimo, from which we get anonymous. Jesus is pointing out something that she would have readily admitted. You worship what you do not know. You've had a temple up there to the god of no name. By the time their conversation, the temple was destroyed a couple hundred years earlier. But this is just the fact. Jesus said to her, one more thing I want to point out in this verse. "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father." This is inclusive. Jesus is assuming and prophesying that you will be, woman, you will be amongst God's true worshipers. You will worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. We know that salvation does not come from an ethnic lineage. Salvation comes through, God used this line of the children of Abraham to bring the Messiah and bring salvation. That's what Jesus is alluding to. But she might have been struck by this. Why is he including me in this you business? But the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Father is seeking such people to worship him. She's surprised yet again. Why is he not talking about the ethnic divisions and religious boundaries that we're supposed to be observing here? He keeps making these inclusive statements. The Father is seeking people, such people. It's an open term. Her mind is being reprogrammed. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. And all are invited is the subtext of Jesus' words to her. But she hasn't quite yet had her ultimate surprise of the day. But she evidently was a woman who who took seriously religious belief. The woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things. And again, a pause, we can imagine. And Jesus answers, I who speak to you am he. And so the Messiah who is always coming, the Messiah will come. Eventually the Messiah comes, but notice he never comes. Well, he has come. He has come, and Jesus reveals the fact that he is the Messiah. The first person in the world he reveals the fact to is this woman who was rejected by the rejected people. And he chooses her to reveal his messiahship to her. Just then the disciples come back from town, and they marveled that he was talking with a woman. But no one had the courage to ask her, what are you looking for? What do you seek? Or to ask him, why are you talking with her? And we can imagine maybe that, maybe their assumptions were, maybe there's something going on in their minds that is better left unsaid. I think we just better pretend we didn't notice that he was talking to a woman unchaperoned. Who knows what they were thinking, but they didn't ask Jesus. They were stuck on this level of the horizontal plane. So the woman left her jar. Notice that she comes to the well thirsty, and she leaves her jar there to carry with her that well that has already begun to spring up into a well of eternal life with her back to the city. She goes back into town, and she says, come and see a man who told me all that I ever did. Can this be the Christ? This is a woman who you can bet was averting her eyes and avoiding social situations. She was rejected by everyone around her. No woman in the town would have trusted her around her husband. Because of this woman's past, you can bet that the last thing she would ever have done would be to openly say to people in her town, you know the stuff I've been doing? Something has flipped in her heart and mind, and it is that living water already bubbling up out of her. Come and see a man who told me everything I ever did. Yeah, I'm not ashamed of it anymore. Because it seems that I have acceptance with the Messiah. And she puts this as a question, can this be the Christ? She's just clever. She's already convinced. She wants people to come and see. Do you think this is the Christ? She's convinced in her heart. She has just met the Messiah. And they went out of the town and were coming to him. Meanwhile, the disciples, still stuck on this horizontal plane where there's water you drink and there's food you eat, and they're puzzled, like, we took that trip into town to buy this food and now nobody wants our food, and this weird woman just left her water jug. What's going on here? The disciples were urging Jesus, saying, Rabbi, eat. But he said to them, I have food to eat that you do not know about. So the disciples said to one another, has anyone brought him something to eat? They're just puzzled. Jesus is always dealing on planes that are above oftentimes where we're at. Jesus said to them, so he explained to them, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. Do you not say there are yet 4 months, then comes the harvest? So we know this is probably the end of May. Look, I tell you, lift up your eyes and see that the fields are white for harvest. The Samaritans, to this day, and back at that time, they had a traditional, if I understand it correctly, they had a traditional garb. They wore a white, I believe it's pronounced jalabia, kind of a long gown, and it tended to be white. And we have this crowd of people coming out of Sychar to this well to meet this possible Messiah. And Jesus is looking over the shoulders of his disciples at this crowd approaching with their white garbs, and he says, "See that the fields are white for harvest." When Jesus asked her for water at the beginning of this story, he no doubt was thirsty physically. But what was really motivating Jesus and what his heart longed for with a depth that none of us can really appreciate or imagine, Jesus was hungry and thirsty to share the living water with even these rejected people and to tear down the barriers, to tear down the boundaries, and invite all manner of men and women into his harvest. So he's speaking here of a harvest that is a harvest of people, with the wheat as a symbol. Many Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me everything I ever did, and yet he still loves me. He seems to care about me. So when the Samaritans came to him, they asked him to stay with them, and he stayed there 2 days. And many more believed because of his word. They said to the woman, "It's no longer because of what you said alone that we believe, for we have heard it ourselves, and we know that this is indeed the Savior of the world." This was already a whole town full of people who were ready to defeat Satan by the word of their testimony, the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. So once again, are you satisfied that Jesus has fulfilled the betrothal type scene? The well in a foreign land stands for fertility or even produce in terms of the kingdom of God. A woman is encountered, a superhuman feat of strength is performed. Jesus reads this woman's life right in front of her. Marriage is intimated or proposed or questioned. The maiden runs to her family or town to announce the coming of the man. The woman's family or townsfolk come to receive the guest. A betrothal agreement is concluded, and we're waiting for the fulfillment of the groom to bring all of his bride into the promised land. A comment that I found helpful from a Stephen Moore: for many who have written on the scene at the Samaritan well, the woman's oblivion to her own need, assumed to be so much greater than that of Jesus, is the pivot on which the irony of their dialogue turns. Deeper by far, however, is the irony that Jesus' own need, not to mention that of his Father's, is just as great as the woman's. Stephen Moore is talking to us about the fact that God has a need that's deeper than we can imagine. Look at the lengths he's gone to win us to his family. The well is deep, as the woman says. Desire, however, is bottomless. And well is it that Jesus sometimes is referred to as the desire of ages. We go back to Hosea. This is our last slide. We go back to Hosea, and we read in Hosea what is, in essence, I think, a marriage vow. Through the prophet Hosea, God speaks to all of us and gives us this promise: "And I will make for them a covenant on that day." And this reads like a marriage vow. "I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you to me in righteousness and in justice, in steadfast love and in mercy. I will betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you shall know the Lord."